Often the most shocking thing to learn when you're first paralyzed is that your bladder and bowel are affected by your spinal cord injury. Most people that have a spinal cord injury lose bladder and bowel control completely, and if they don't lose it completely, they have at least some level of bladder and bowel dysfunction that they're going to have to learn to manage. When I was 13 and I was first paralyzed, I remember this being the hardest thing to cope with my new disability. I could cope with not walking, but having to figure out how to manage my bowel and bladder seemed really overwhelming to me. And I remember asking the doctor if I was going to have to wear a diaper for the rest of my life because I just couldn't imagine how anyone could manage their bowel and bladder when they couldn't feel when they had to go to the bathroom, or control when they wanted to go to the bathroom. So I was, just really overwhelmed. The doctor, luckily, was really kind and reassured me that no, I didn't have to wear diapers for the rest of my life, and that there were lots of strategies to manage a neurogenic bladder and bowel, which is just the fancy term for what happens to your bladder and bowel when you're paralyzed. I went home learning all the strategies that I was taught in the hospital, but I never really understood what happened to my bowel from paralysis, and I didn't even really understand it until I was an adult, and it really made it harder to manage the neurogenic bladder and bowel that I now had because I didn't really understand how to influence the things that I still had control over. A few years ago, I did a video on what happens to your bladder when you're paralyzed and how to manage a neurogenic bladder, and in this video, I'm going to talk about what happens to your bowel when you're paralyzed and how to manage a neurogenic bowel. And I hope that I'm going to give you the information that I wish I had gotten from the doctors, because there's still lots of things that you can influence in your gastrointestinal tract, even though you might not have control over them anymore. And I'm going to teach you some of those things today. So if you're newly paralyzed, I hope this video helps you have an understanding of your body a little bit better and gives you some peace of mind that even though you can't necessarily voluntarily control your bowel anymore, there are still ways to manage it effectively. And there are still lots of things you can actually control about your digestion and your pooping. So here we go. I'm going to kick this video off with a explanation of basically how the bowel is innervated and how it is affected by paralysis. And then I'm going to give you some information on the different types of neurogenic bowels that you can have when you're paralyzed, and then some ways to manage it. But before I get into any of that stuff, I want to give you a little short anatomy lesson of the digestive tract, just so that you understand what structures I'm referring to when we're going through all of the information. So let's do that first. Starting at your top of your digestive tract, which is your esophagus. That's where you swallow your food. It goes down to the next part, which is your stomach. And then after the stomach kind of churns up all the food and stuff, it goes into your small intestine, which is responsible for digesting all of the nutrients. And then after that, the waste goes to your large intestine, which is like a big U that goes over your small intestines. And the job of the large intestine is basically to reabsorb water and any electrolytes and things like that you don't need to lose or don't want to lose. And then it goes down farther where it's just holding the stool, essentially, waiting for a bowel movement. There are 3 parts of your large intestine that we're going to talk about specifically. The ascending colon, which is on the right side of your body if you're just like looking at yourself. The left side of somebody else's body if you're looking at them. So it goes up, and then the transverse colon goes horizontally across your body. And then the descending colon turns back downwards, and then it heads towards the rectum, which is the tube that sort of holds the stool right before a bowel movement, and then ends at the anus, which is just a fancy word for your butthole. So those are all the things that I'm going to be referring to structurally when I'm giving you the information. And before I start giving you the information, I just want to give a big shout out to Temple Rehab's YouTube channel and Dr. Wesley Chay, who gave a lecture essentially on that channel to other doctors. It was like a lecture he did for other doctors, and it was all about the bowel after spinal cord injury. And a lot of the information that I'm going to be talking about is from that lecture. If you want to go check that lecture out, there's a link to it in the description of this video. He gives a lot of scientific, doctory sounding information, so I'm summarizing most of it. But if you really want all of the information in depth, you can go over there and check that video out. Okay, so let's get started. We are going to talk about how the bowel sort of is innervated and how it functions in the body. And then we'll talk about the things that we can do to manage our neurogenic bowel, with an understanding of the ways that the bowel functions. So the bowel is controlled by your autonomic nervous system. So it basically runs on its own. You don't have to think about it. It just goes on its own. And it's controlled by the autonomic nervous system with 3 different branches of the autonomic nervous system. So the first branch is the enteric nervous system, which is the nervous system, the autonomic part of your nervous system that controls your gastrointestinal tract. So it's a special one that's specifically for gastrointestinal control. Then we have the sympathetic nervous system, which is like the fight or flight part of your autonomic nervous system, and it affects your bowel and bladder in a specific way. And then the parasympathetic nervous system, which is your like rest and digest, which is probably the most important for our bowel. So we'll start with the enteric nervous system and how it sort of controls your bowel and the things that it influences. So the enteric nervous system controls stool propulsion, so like peristalsis, and pushing the food down your esophagus, getting it through basically your entire digestive tract. It controls the muscle contractions and all of that stuff. And then it also controls secretions and absorption. So any mucus secretions that need to happen to protect your stomach from the acid, to protect your cells in your digestive tract from like the food and all the things that are going through it. It does that. And then it also controls the absorption of fluids throughout your digestive tract. And then the parasympathetic nervous system, it increases motility, which just means it moves food faster through your stomach and your intestines. It relaxes sphincters, the ones that need to move food from your stomach to your intestines and from your intestines out to the rest of the world. And then it initiates a defecation reflex, and that's one of the things that we can sort of influence when we're talking about our bowel management program. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. And the parasympathetic control system for your digestive tract is controlled by your vagus nerve from the esophagus to the mid-transverse colon. So remember when we were talking about the large intestine, the transverse colon is the horizontal part that sort of goes under your rib cage horizontally. And that part is controlled by your vagus nerve. So from your esophagus to halfway across your transverse colon is controlled by the vagus nerve, which has nothing to do with the spinal cord. So it actually comes out from your brain and bypasses the spinal cord entirely. So most of the parasympathetic control to your spine or to your gastrointestinal tract is intact after a spinal cord injury, unless you have damage to your vagus nerve. And then the rest of your lower digestive tract, so the mid-transverse colon and the descending colon, is controlled by the pelvic nerve, which comes out of the spine at S2, from S2 to S4. So that part of your parasympathetic control of your gastrointestinal tract is affected by a spinal cord injury. So from your mid-transverse colon and beyond is kind of paralyzed. So we have to figure out a way to manage that with a bowel program, which we're going to talk about later. The last part is the sympathetic nervous system control. So the sympathetic nervous system control is the fight or flight, and that usually shuts down digestion, and it inhibits motility, so it slows down the food going through your digestive tract. It reduces blood flow to the intestines and overall just like impedes digestion. And that is controlled by nerves that come out of from T9 to basically L3. So there's different nerve roots and groupings that control different things, but basically they come out from T9 to L3. So that can be affected from your spinal cord injury depending on where your injury is, obviously. Just to summarize, your enteric nervous system, which normally controls like the propulsion of food through your digestive tract, like with peristalsis and all of that stuff, it's intact after your spinal cord injury. It's not affected by your spinal cord injury. Your parasympathetic control, which is like the rest and digest area of your gastrointestinal control, it is partially affected by a spinal cord injury because the lower part of your large intestine is kind of paralyzed. And then the sympathetic nervous control of your gastrointestinal tract can be affected by your spinal cord injury depending on your level of injury. So those are just like the general sort of ways that your gastrointestinal tract can be affected by paralysis. And then when you're paralyzed, there's kind of two main ways that your bowel can behave after your injury, depending on where your level of injury is. And they refer to the two sort of ways as an upper motor neuron neurogenic bowel or a lower motor neuron neurogenic bowel. And they are very different in how they behave. And the reason that they are different is because the nerves that are affected and that control your anal sphincter are affected differently. So when you have an upper motor neuron neurogenic bowel, you tend to have anal sphincter tone, which just means your butthole stays tight. The reflexes that kind of control the defecation response, which we'll talk about in a little bit, are intact. And we can stimulate those reflexes, those intact reflexes, to initiate a bowel movement. When you have a lower motor neuron neurogenic bowel, the rectum and your anal sphincter tend to be flaccid. So they are looser. You tend to leak stool more often, not always. And the way you manage a lower motor neuron neurogenic bowel is different because the reflexes that we talked about earlier, the reflex that initiates a bowel movement and that keeps your anal sphincter tone intact, those aren't there anymore. So we just have to do different things in order to manage it. For an upper motor neuron neurogenic bowel, just in general, we tend to keep the stool looser, not entirely like watery, but we can keep the stool looser because your anal sphincter tone is tight, and that will keep the stool in until you initiate a bowel movement. And we can stimulate the defecation reflex that I'll talk about in a little bit to sort of initiate a bowel movement. And in a lower motor neuron neurogenic bowel, you don't have those reflexes intact. So generally you have to keep your stool harder so that it doesn't just leak on you. And you have to do your bowel routine more often so that if there is anything in your lower rectum ready to come out, it's not leaking, right? So you do bowel routine generally more often and you keep your stool firmer so that it's not leaking. So those are the two types of neurogenic bowel that exist when you have a spinal cord injury, and how they're different. Now I want to talk about some of the similarities between the types of neurogenic bowel when you have a spinal cord injury. So they decrease gastric emptying, which just means that your stomach empties slower. You have increased bowel transit time, which means that when you eat something, it takes longer to go from your stomach essentially to defecation or having a bowel movement. A normal bowel transit time is between 12 and 30 hours for an able-bodied individual, obviously depending on the differences between people. Some people get very constipated, but generally it's 12 to 30 hours. And in a person with a spinal cord injury, it can double. Not everybody has that doubling, but it can effectively double in a lot of people just because your bowel motility slows down. Which is the next one. Decreased colonic motility, so just moving the stool through your intestines just becomes slower. And then anal sphincter tone becomes affected. So with people with an upper motor neuron neurogenic bowel, the sphincter tone is tight, and then in the lower motor neuron neurogenic bowel, the sphincter tone is flaccid. So those are the ways that they are similar. Changes in anal sphincter tone, decreased motility, slower gastric emptying, and increased bowel transit time. So how do we manage all of this stuff? The goal of a bowel program, which is what we all learn to do when we leave the hospital, is to establish a predictable, regular, thorough evacuation without the occurrence of incontinence. So we just want to poop regularly, and we don't want to poop our pants. That's basically it. And the ways that we can do that differ between injury level and all of that stuff, but that's what we're trying to achieve. And then the things to consider when we're establishing a bowel routine is our previous bowel habits. So if you went once a day before you were paralyzed, it's probably a good idea to go once a day after you're paralyzed. If you went twice a day, it might be a good idea to go twice a day. If you went once every 3 days and you try to go every day after you're paralyzed, it might not work so well. So you have to just kind of keep in mind the ways that your body functioned before so that it kind of stays in line with what it's used to doing. You have to take into account diet, because what you're eating really affects how fast things move through your digestive tract. If you're eating lots of fiber or not enough fiber, if you're drinking lots of water or not enough water. So you have to consider that. You have to consider your own needs. Like, the needs of the individual matter a lot. So if you have care, or you have specific things that you have to do in the morning that you can't manage to get your bowel routine done then, or if the evening is really inconvenient. So you have to manage your lifestyle and your own needs and sort of build your bowel routine around that as well. And then you have to take into consideration your activity level, because the more you move, generally, the better your bowel habits are. So those are just some of the things that you need to consider when you are deciding on how to manage your neurogenic bowel. Now we're going to talk about the different reflexes that are important to know about and that we can influence in order to manage our bowels after we're paralyzed. And these are different for the upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron. So just keep in mind which one you have. And if you're not sure, then you can go to your physiatrist and get tested, because basically what they do is they stick their finger up your butt, and then if your butthole basically tightens around their finger, then it's an indication that you have an upper motor neuron neurogenic bowel. Okay, so understanding the reflexes. What are the reflexes that control digestion? So the first reflex is the gastrocolic reflex, which is the reflex that occurs when your stomach stretches. So when your stomach stretches after you eat, it initiates all of the muscle contractions that move food through your digestive tract so that it can make room for the food that's coming from your stomach. This reflex is important because we try to use the reflex to initiate a bowel movement, because as things are moving from our stomach, the rest is moving through our digestive tract, and usually it can help initiate a bowel movement when you're paralyzed. So a lot of people, not me, but a lot of people try to time their bowel movements for 30 minutes, or their bowel routine for 30 minutes after they've eaten. And even if they do a morning bowel routine like I do, some people eat a little something in the morning before they have their bowel movement, so that it just sort of primes the pump, so to speak, in order for the food to be moving down your digestive tract. So that's the first sort of reflex that we can influence. We can time our bowel routine around our meals and hopefully improve our ability to have a bowel movement, a full evacuation. The next one is the colon-colonic reflex, which is the colon's response to stretch receptors. So this is how we can influence our bowel routine with things like bulk forming laxatives, and we take stool bulking supplements like psyllium husk or Metamucil, anything like that that makes your stool more bulky and puts more fiber into your colon is going to stimulate those stretch receptors and stimulate the colon-colonic reflex, which helps initiate a bowel movement. So just having enough fiber, not too much, not too little, can help initiate a bowel movement. I've had mixed results with this. I used to eat a lot of fiber, and then my bowel got addicted to it, and I sort of had to back off. So I just caution people to not eat too much fiber. I think 15 grams of fiber is like enough for somebody that's paralyzed if you're not drinking a crap ton of water, because in order for fiber to be effective, it also has to be like liquidy with water. Otherwise, you just get constipated. So make sure that if you're going to eat fiber, you drink a lot of water to absorb in your intestines with the fiber, so that it doesn't harden your stool. Because you don't want to just initiate those stretch receptors just for the stool to get stuck in your colon. So play around with the fiber, and I don't recommend eating more than 15 grams of fiber a day unless you do really well with fiber. I know some people that are paralyzed, they eat like 30, 40 grams of fiber a day, especially the ones with lower motor neuron neurogenic bowels that tend to need that firmer stool so that they don't have accidents or have any incontinence or leaking. If that's you, then by all means eat more fiber. But for people that have an upper motor neuron neurogenic bowel, fiber can sometimes be a menace. So just be careful with it. And then the last reflex is the rectocolonic reflex, which is the reflex that responds to distension or irritation of the skin or tissue in your rectum. And this is the reflex that we are trying to influence when we use a suppository or do digital stimulation. So digital stimulation is the act of putting your finger in your anus and moving it in a circular motion. This stimulates the rectocolonic reflex, which then moves stool from higher in your descending colon down to the rectum and out. And when you have a suppository, it irritates the skin inside your rectum, and it does the same thing. It stimulates the reflex that creates a bowel movement that's paralyzed from your mid-transverse colon to your descending colon. So that part of your bowel that we talked about that is paralyzed, we're trying to stimulate the reflex in that part of your colon that is paralyzed, that's controlled by your parasympathetic nervous system. So when we do mechanical irritation, then we are stimulating that paralyzed reflex that stimulates a bowel movement. So those are all the reflexes and how they kind of help us initiate a bowel movement. The gastrocolic reflex is still intact with an upper motor neuron neurogenic bowel. The coloclonic reflex is still intact when you have a lower motor neuron neurogenic bowel, but the rectocolonic reflex, we can't control that one because the nerves that would normally initiate that reflex are damaged. So digital stimulation doesn't typically help people with a lower motor neuron neurogenic bowel. They do something similar, but it's basically just bowel disimpaction. They're just, sticking their finger up their butt in order to get the stool out of their rectum. They're not actually doing the turn of their finger that then loosens their rectum or loosens their anus. It's just already kind of loose when they're doing their bowel routine. So if you have an upper motor neuron neurogenic bowel, suppositories and mechanical stimulation, irritation will work for you, but not so much if you have a lower motor neuron neurogenic bowel. So just keep that in mind when you're deciding which strategies to use and which ones will effectively help you manage your bowel routine. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is the pharmacological interventions to manage your bowel routine. The things that they typically give you in the hospital to help you with your bowel routine are stool softeners, bulk formers, which is like fiber supplements like Metamucil. They give you peristaltic stimulants, which are things that actually help the muscles contract to move the stool through your intestinal tract. And typically they give you Senecot. And then they give you a contact stimulant with a suppository, generally. And sometimes they give you osmotic laxatives that draw water into your bowel, which is basically like a stool softener. I'm not entirely sure how stool softeners are different than osmotic laxatives. But osmotic laxatives are typically things that are like magnesium. They're minerals that if you have too much of them, get flushed out in your pee and in your poop, and then they draw water just through osmosis, through like a concentration gradient. If you know anything about chemistry and biology, when there's too much of one mineral or substance in one area, water likes to move into that area in order to even out the concentrations of that mineral. So when you just eat a lot of magnesium, like in magnesium citrate or other osmotic laxative type things, then it'll come out in your bowel if you don't need it in your body, and then the water will follow it there. And then the last thing is like enemas. Enemas are basically just adding water to the bottom part of your rectum in order to help flush the stool out that's already there. So those are the sort of typical things that we see that people get shown in the hospital in order to manage their bowel routine. And you absolutely can use all of them, but you don't really need to use all of them, especially with the like peristaltic stimulants like Senecot and other stimulant laxatives. Those can become habit forming, and if you use them too much because your body builds a tolerance to them, they can actually create a flaccid bowel. So your bowel no longer really contracts like a normal muscle should, and then it's really, really, really hard to poop. So I always try and say, if you can get started on your bowel routine with those kinds of things, just so you can establish your bowel routine, and then after you've established a bowel routine, you try and like wean off of those things, and then try and manage your bowel with routine and diet mostly, and then a few supplements. So the osmotic laxatives that I take are just magnesium supplements. I take magnesium bisglycinate, and I take enough to keep my stool a certain consistency so that it's not too soft, it's not too hard. And then I just, manage it with eating fruits and vegetables and things like that. So you can really control your bowel consistency with food and fiber and magnesium supplements and things like that. And I think playing around with that is probably more important than using a bunch of other pharmacological interventions, because we don't want to kind of get our bowels addicted to things that will lose their effectiveness over time. Okay, so those are basically all of the things that I wanted to talk about. Managing stool consistency with fiber is a whole nother conversation, and so are laxatives, because there is a lot to talk about in terms of laxatives and the different types and all of that stuff. So I'm going to do a different video just specifically on laxatives, because there's a bunch of different types. I gave you like a rundown here of the different ones. But to summarize, I just want to kind of give you guys an overview of the things that you can control in your bowel routine. If you have an upper motor neuron, neurogenic bowel, you can control the reflexes that stimulate a bowel movement. That is the rectocolonic reflex that we are trying to stimulate using a suppository and digital stimulation. And those are probably the most important ones that we can initiate or that we can influence, because they help us time our bowel movement, which is really helpful. You can control your gastrocolic reflex, so you can time your bowel routine after you eat so that it's already sort of primed to move the stool through your digestive tract. And then using these pharmacological agents like stool bulking, or even just eating foods that have fiber in them, you can sort of influence the colocolonic reflex, which is the stretching in your colon when there is enough food and fiber in there. And then if you have a lower motor neuron neurogenic bowel, you can still control your gastrocolonic reflex, which is your stomach filling, so timing your bowel program after your meals. And you can still control the colocolonic reflex, which is the stretching of your colon. So you can take some of the stool bulking agents and things like that that allow your colon to stretch in response to the fiber in there, and then that can help initiate a bowel movement. So those are the ways that your bowel is affected after you're paralyzed, and how you can kind of control a neurogenic bowel. And I know that my doctors just didn't really explain this to me, and it was really helpful when I learned about this. Just understanding that the lower part of my colon is paralyzed, but that I can control that paralyzed portion by stimulating the reflexes that are still intact in that portion was really helpful to me. You can stimulate reflexes that initiate a bowel movement, and you can control when you stimulate them. And that is really important, because I feel like just knowing that little bit helps you know that you have a level of control still over when you have a bowel movement, which is really reassuring. I think that's all I wanted to talk about. If you guys have any questions about what happens to your bowel when you're paralyzed, and all of the things that I was talking about, or any of the things that I was talking about in this video, you can put them in the comments and I will try to answer them. It's always kind of hard doing these, really heavy knowledge or education-based videos, because it's hard for me to explain some of the things and have a good flow to it. But I hope what I've said you've been able to understand. And if you didn't, please let me know so that I can make changes to videos in the future on how I explain them, whether I go slower or I just make sure I have a better flow, whatever it is. I would love the feedback from you guys. So I will do a video after this on laxatives and fiber, just so that it's kind of a follow-up, and then you guys should have all the information you need about how to effectively control your bowel program as a paraplegic or quadriplegic or whatever you have that creates a neurogenic bowel. That's all I got for you guys today. But before I go, I just want to remind you of my Patreon community. It is just $2 a month to join, and you get access to all of my videos ad-free, and then you get them a few days ahead of time before I post them on YouTube. And then if you are interested in joining my $10 tier, you get to do Zoom hangouts with me 4 times a year where we have fun activities and just get to know each other better, which is really fun as a content creator, because it's really hard sometimes to be able to engage on a really personal level with all of you guys in the comments. So yeah, if you're interested in joining that, you can go to the link in the description of this video, and I would be so appreciative if you would consider supporting me over there. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I will catch you back here on another video. Bye!